right. Well, I guess the first thing that needs to be addressed here today, as I know that people have been listening to WLS throughout from yesterday through today, is the passing of Jake Hartford, our my colleague here and at CBS for the past more than 25 years. And it is it's a tough thing. And it was funny. I was on with Jake and John Cass just started formally their own show here on WLS,
right,
from 9 to 11, and just a few weeks ago it was formalized, and then Jake passes away, and I was in today talking to John about Jake, and I thought, and he got a little maudlin, and I thought Jake is the exact last guy who liked maudlin. He made fun of maudlin. Maudlin was not his friend. And so I think, obviously, we're going to acknowledge it. Interestingly enough, they've found some tape of me and of Jake from 1989 and 1990 and 1991 when we were first starting here. Because, and I told the story this morning, I'll just tell it quickly again, that he was my boss at Channel 2. I worked for Walter Jacobson, and so did Jim, that's Jake's real name, Jim Edwards. And see, people are learning things they didn't know already.
I know.
And Walter's here. We're going to talk to him in just a few minutes about this, because if I can do anything today for my friend, I think there's a part of his story that I want to share that I don't think anybody knows, and they can't possibly know, because he was an undercover producer for many, many, many years, and secrecy was his calling card.
Just a week or two ago, you and I were talking off the air just about various people and the way, the circles all intersect, and some people know people very well in the city, and some you just kind of brush up against or you see when you're covering stories. But, we were talking about various types of producers, and you told me just a week or two ago, you were like, Jake, as Jim Edwards, was the best TV producer I ever worked with. The guy was unbelievable. Just working with him, you talked about what a privilege it was, and that it was strange because he had this dual existence as
Goofy
the irascible Jake, who would tell people to set their clocks back when it was time to spring forward, and would do the jizzies and all that kind of fun stuff. And then this guy who was just as good as it gets in the hard news arena.
Right.
As a TV producer with trophies everywhere and accolades, and people on the inside knew, but it's almost the equivalent of when we talk about some of the CIA operatives that never get credit, or the various, there's people who have jobs who do a great work and never really get the credit.
Right.
And they're okay with that. That's why they went into that side of the business.
A funny sidebar here is that the press has been asking for pictures of him. We don't have pictures of him. He's got one picture that he allowed the station to take. He did because, again, he didn't want people to know who he was, because he and I spent a lot of time in those couple of years that I had the privilege of working with him and with Walter at CBS. We'd have to go undercover. We had to go not necessarily disguised, but we couldn't be noticed. So you didn't want anybody who was recognizable. And there was something about the physical nature of Jim that is so interesting, because he looked like every other guy you see on the street.
Yeah.
And so he would blend in. And he had looked like a guy who might be a streets and sand guy, or a cop, or a firefighter, or a ward worker, or whatever. So he would so when we would do stuff, and his greatest investigative work was going out and chasing city workers who were ghost payrolling and no-show jobs, and guys who were scamming the system, for that disability and things like that. And now you see a news or operation do it like once a year. They'll go out and they'll catch guys. I know Fox Chicago did it last year with Dane Placco, and they catch guys who are on the payroll who are playing golf and say they have disability. We did it 5 nights a week.
Well, the thing is too, for a guy like Jim and his capacity in his grown-up job as a news producer, you know, a guy like Walter, who did, of course, sometimes go undercover himself in some of his most famous pieces. But, you know, Walter became one of the most recognizable faces in Chicago. So if he would go out first on a story, he'd affect the story.
Right.
With his Walterness.
Right.
So, you know, you get to a point where it's like, you know, you have to have someone doing that legwork for you or you won't be able to do the job. I remember, you know, Mike Roeper wrote a column once about the fact that he stopped going to trials because the judge would call recess, call him into his chambers and say, "What can I do for you, Mike?"
Yeah.
You lose that fly on the wall.
Correct. And that's what Jim was, and that's what I was, and the many other great people who came out of that unit, and many of whom were trained by this guy that we know as Jake Hartford, you know, who trained me in how to ask every question, you know, think to globally look at whatever the thing was that we had to look at, whatever the issue was, globally look at it and pierce it. And, you know, Walter taught me this and Jim taught me this, to pierce it from 360 degrees. Because if you just, and this is the thing that drives me nuts now about the state of journalism and the state of talk radio and the state of a lot of things, is that it's now just become about representing one point of view. Right. And it's about reflecting, taking a look at any given issue and just reflecting it off of that one point of view, whether it's left or right. And that's how it's now broken down. And that's not what true journalism is about. And I don't think that's necessarily good for the culture, because the left is not always right, the right is not always right. And you have to be able to look at a problem and tear it apart. And yes, a lot of stuff, and in journalism, a lot of it does, the majority of it, or was, looked at from the left for generations. But now it looked at it from the right, but it isn't, you know, they're playing this ticky-tack game. And so all of this, these last 24 hours, you know, put it all in perspective for me that, you know, he was one of these great teachers, too. And it's a funny thing, because, you know, we're talking about, like you said, crazy, irascible Jake, who was this sort of everyman comedic figure on WLS, and what that dude was really all about was what those 12 Emmys on his wall represent, and those stories that he broke, and the things. And we'll talk to Walter about some of the most, you know, important moments in, I think to my eye, I mean, I know Walter's he's got, you know, 40 years, 50 years almost of journalism experience in Chicago, and, you know, Jim was only there for 10 or 12, 14, whatever there was of those years, but those were some pretty great moments. And there were some stories everybody will recognize, including the first time Walter went homeless, or a Trooper Link story, or the some of the other great, the John Wayne Gacy interview, or the Richard Speck video, which happened later. That was something he did for CBS after Walter left. That you know, things like that occurred that were his enterprising. But anyway, I was going to tell the story, which I will tell now, about how he ended up on the air, and we'll play it.
Yeah, right now he would have been saying, get to the point. You started with one story and you went off on a side tangent. So break for traffic and weather and get back and tell the story.
All right, so the first time that Jake Hartford was on the air with me, it was a couple weeks into my first time of doing this.
Okay.
And I had gotten hired here by Drew Hayes, who's now here, ironically, the third tour of duty. And they were putting LS on the air as a talk station as opposed to a music station. And you were getting hired right around that period of time, too,
right,
as a weekender. And I was getting hired as a weekender, and I was given the assignment of doing an overnight show. And I'd never done 5 hours I'd done 3 hours at a time of radio, and I'd done that 4 times. So my fifth time out of doing my own show was a 5-hour overnight show, and I knew there were going to be no callers. So I thought there would be very few. So I enlisted Jake, because we were working in the Jake unit at CBS, and his dog at the time, his name was Hartford. So we decided to do the porn star name, Jake Hartford.
Ah, okay.
And we made him into a travel guy, because he was, you know, kind of a guy who liked to travel and knew a lot about traveling. So I thought, well, we needed just a pad. We needed a hook to bring him into, so I could just have somebody to talk to, because we would spend hours and hours and hours in surveillance cars talking to each other, and it was always fun. It was always very entertaining. So I thought, well, this is a perfect kind of combination to sort of trot this out. So we did it. And I got a call from Drew the next day, like, what is this guy doing here? I didn't ask for another guy. What are you doing? Why do you have this guy on?
I'm not paying that guy.
That's exactly what he said. And I said, the guy's really fun. And so over the years, because Jake was, as in Robert Feeder's Time Out Chicago column on the web, he did an obit piece yesterday. Mm-hmm. He pointed out that Jake was a confidant to 2 governors, countless senators, congressmen, aldermen, mayors. People would lean on him for his expertise because he knew everything about what was going on behind the scenes, and he knew everybody. And
he was actually too smart and well-traveled for radio, and yet it still worked.
Yeah. I think he just loved it, though. I mean, I think he just loved radio, you know?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So to have him, it was interesting how LS started to sort of use his expertise in things for context, to get guests, there were a few stumbles where talk shows found their way into trouble on the air, public trouble, you know, with advocacy groups and things like that. And Jake was at Channel 2. He was a fixer. There's a story. I don't know. I guess I'll tell. I don't know if I should, but I'm
when in doubt, go ahead with it.
I'm just going to go ahead and do it. We had a Jim Avila, who we have on all the time.
Sure.
Was a reporter at Channel 2 at the time. And Jim was going down to Cali, Colombia to shoot a story about the Cali cartel. This is in the late 80s when the cocaine trade was the big story. And the cameraman that they wanted to use was a great cameraman, unbelievably great, but he did not have a passport. He'd somehow had a passport, lost a passport, didn't have a passport, whatever it was.
Okay.
12 hours later, Jake presented him with a passport.
Wow.
And I am still, to this moment, not sure how he did it.
Statute of limitations passed.
I know. And what are they going to do to him? But it was just one of those crazy things.
He had connections.
Yeah. And I never knew. And you know what? As well as I knew him, and I'm proud to say that, our families were very close, and we've known each other a really long time. I never had the balls to ask him how he did that. Because I didn't want to know.
There's no answer that's going to really help you, for you to know that. No matter what he tells you. And whatever he tells you is not going to be what really happened anyway, so you're better off not knowing.
Probably true.
Take the passport and get in line.
Maybe just my innate curiosity. But anyway, that first show on the air went a little something like this.
It's a tricky business that the Illinois Bell people have gotten us into now.
Certainly is. Certainly is.
Were you going to say something?
No.
That's the way I like it. Midway.
Hello.
Hello. The island of Midway?
Pardon?
Where are you calling from?
By Midway Airport.
Oh, by Midway Airport. I see.
Southwest side.
Southwest side.
Right.
Yeah.
Midway Airport.
Mm-hmm.
Over by there.
Don't laugh. Now, okay.
Yeah.
You want to make a mid-dome stadium? Stadium for football teams? They should do this. All their pension plans from, governor on, state senators, and, and residents, put their pension on it and build it.
It's very good that the Northwest Airline Pilots Association is calling us now, isn't it?
He's got a very good point about the...
Would you like to share that point? What was that point he was trying to make?
Well, I think what he's saying is if somebody wants a dome stadium and the politicians are for it, let them put their money into it. Let them put their own pension money into it rather than taxpayer dollars.
That was the first show ever.
I want to apologize for that call I made so many years ago to you guys. We were all jockeying for position. What's amazing is Jake's voice there sounds exactly like it did last week.
Yeah. I know.
In fact, so is yours.
Nah, well, I had the Jim Johnson affected theater lilt in my voice at that point.
You were a lot more thoughtful.
That's when everyone wanted to sound sort of like this. All right.
Jim, don't tell me he sounds exactly the same right now, kids.
Walter Jacobson will be joining us.
Oh, great.
Coming up right after this. Also, Ron Majors at the top there. He returns. Ron Major returns. We'll also try to, speaking of interpreting, we'll try to interpret what happened at the Golden Globes last night when Jodie Foster, friend of the show, came out. I don't understand what happened there. Rocky Wirtz is going to join us. The Hawks are back. We'll get the details on that. A little update on the playoffs. A lot of things going on. And a great controversy with Flirty Girl a flirty girl.
Yeah.
There's in Lincoln Park, they don't want a flirty girl. That's why they invented Lincoln Park.
89 WALS. When you want Chicago's classic hits, turn to 94.7 WLS for traffic and weather info. Tune into 890 AM WLS for traffic and weather first on the fives when you need it most.
Speaking of mayors with tin ears, New York and New Jersey and the whole East Coast was a tragedy. The fact that Mayor Bloomberg wanted to run the marathon after making that decision after 2 days after the storm hit, did no one stand up to him and say, Mayor, that's a bad idea?
Well, I'm not privy to what goes on in the mayor's inner council of his staff.
But would you have run the marathon in Chicago if that happened in Chicago?
Look, I'm not going to. Don't try to put me in a position. Look, the mayor. The good news is he backed down. The main thing is getting the city back up on its feet, back down from his original thing. And on the other hand, he has to see a city through in an incredible natural weather-related crisis, and he also has a president that's ready to help him. I can somewhat. I mean, this is just. I really shouldn't do what I'm about to do, but I think what he was trying to do, if I understand it correctly, is communicate that we're going to get back to normal.
All right, there's Jake Hartford, the late, great Jake Hartford, on WLS with Rahm Emanuel, getting Rahm Emanuel to be honest about something, which... And I don't want to say that Rahm Emanuel is not honest about things, but I want to say that, he obviously pushed him into a corner that he had to respond to, and I think that's what great talk shows and great journalists do. And Jake Hartford was who died on Saturday, and we're remembering him right now. Not just Jake Hartford here. This was really his. This was an alter ego for him. This was a kind of a side, fun, light for him as he was retiring out of his television career. He had spent decades as a television producer, both at Channel 9 and then most famously and most prolifically at CBS 2 with Walter Jacobson. And Walter's in the studio with us. And I want to just talk a little bit about the process, and I had the great pleasure. That's how I met Jim in the first place, and how he ended up here at WLS was through you. But I want to talk a little bit about that process of what would happen. We had to go out and do 5 of these stories, 5 2.5-minute stories, investigative pieces, not opinion pieces, investigative pieces with real research and prove it every day, 5 days a week, essentially 48 weeks out of the year.
Right. And it was no stop, very difficult assignment to come up with that kind of information that many days a week for that amount of time on television. And I should say that, sometimes the longer you work on a column, Richard, or the longer you work on a story on the radio and television, the easier it is to tell it in length. And if you have to squish it down to 2.5 minutes, you've got to be all that much more careful. And one thing about Jim Edwards that I will never forget, of course, is that he was always a backstop. We had to be very careful to not make a mistake. And when you're doing the kind of work we were doing, you and I were doing, and all the others who worked there for so long were doing, we were in positions where we could make mistakes, just a simple little mistake, and we'd get caught because there was a lot of attention on what we were doing, and there were a lot of people we were kind of pushing around and hurting who would call the general manager of the station and say, Jacobson was wrong, damn it, do something about it. And then I'd have to go back to you or to Jim Edwards and say, I'm in trouble because I've been told by the general manager that I said something wrong, or he was told that I said something wrong, and we've got to get it right. And over all the years that we worked together, and guys, after all the 50 years that I've been doing it, I don't think I was caught doing something wrong more than 4 or 5 times, which is amazing. And it came to that kind of success and accuracy because of the footwork that Jim Edwards and you and others were doing. It's just a whole different process.
And Walter, you make such a great point because you have to have 100% confidence because you're the guy on the air saying that this guy's doing this wrong or this organization is corrupt or whatever the case may be. I mean, lives and careers could be forever altered by one of those pieces.
Right.
And you could only do it in your inimitable style if you knew that everything was in place before you went there. Thanks to guys like Roe. Thanks to guys like Jim Edwards.
I think Jim gets the lion's share of the credit. I mean, I was a rookie walking into a situation just learning. I take very little credit for the things that happened over
Well,
there.
I read about you in Feeder this morning or yesterday, saying that everything you learned from Jim Edwards.
Yeah.
I was going to say the same thing.
That's the thing. You know, a guy like Jim, who not only was, hugely talented and dogged as a reporter, as a producer, but also so generous, because you don't always get that with veterans in this business, as you guys know. Some are very, gracious and are happy to mentor, and others are going to tell you just enough to let you do your job, but no more. But that's like getting a master's degree in journalism if you get a chance to work with someone like that.
If I had $1 for every time I heard Jim Edwards, who's Jake Hartford, and he's Jake because of Walter Jacobson, that was the name of our unit. That's what we were called in the building. If I had $1 for every time I heard Jake say to Jake, "You can't say that, Walter,"
Yeah.
I would be a millionaire.
Right, I remember that. He always did that, and I had to take it very seriously. Although we could, Richard, get away with some of the stuff we said if there was a mistake, and there were very few, by admitting the mistake as soon as you possibly
Get in front of it, yeah.
And it wasn't.
And
it didn't happen very.
It
Didn't happen. I don't recall when I was there, certainly, but I know that there are times, and you very famously. You went through a lawsuit where they said you were wrong, and you lost the lawsuit, and you were right, as it turned out.
Right.
In the end, you were eventually, when it came to tobacco companies marketing to kids, which is what is very famous. They teach it in every law school. Brennan Williamson versus CBS. It's a moment now, though. I think which is different than it's ever been in our business, in journalism specifically, because what would happen is Jake Hartford would come in every day, or the days he was assigned to do the stories, because we all had different days of doing the stories, and we would use a still photographer. We didn't use camera guys because we couldn't go out and use, especially back in that day, in the 80s, still technology has changed so much. You can be very stealth with a camera. Yeah. You couldn't then. You had to. A camera wasn't one guy; it was two guys going out at that time, because there was a sound guy and the camera guy, and sometimes three guys. And so when we would go out undercover. We'd go out with a still photographer. We'd go out and get city workers who were not in the places they were supposed to be. There's one of the greatest pictures of all times, and we should sell it to the highest bidder, of a streets and sand guy sleeping in his truck with his feet hanging out of the truck, and it's just the streets, Chicago streets and sand, and you just see these 2 feet. and we time-stamped it, and was it like at 9 a.m., at noon, at 5, right. At, just sort of, the guy never moved, and I thought he had to be dead, because no one can get circulation to their feet that way. But, wow. But it's stories like that Jim and you, the thing is that your career, Walter, when people say, "Oh, Walter Jacobson," they tell the story of you from that era. That's what they talk about. They talk about those kinds of stories, that kind of gotcha story about some guy ripping off the system, screwing the taxpayers, or a big fish eating a little fish unfairly.
And, one of the positive things about days past is that still photography can really be much, much more effective than the moving camera. You really can look at a picture long enough to understand what's going on.
Absolutely.
Whereas when you're watching moving video, it goes by you so fast, sometimes you miss the whole thing you were going at. So if you or Jim or I or any of us went out with a still camera ourselves sometimes and got the pictures, which we had to do, as you say, so we weren't identified as reporters, we'd come up with something a lot better than moving video. I think it's too bad we don't do that now.
I want to ask Walter about, there's a great story, which we will tell, about when Walter went homeless. And Jim, and we will tell that story.
For the younger people out there, it was part of an assignment. Walter never fell on those types of tough times as Walter Jacobson, the individual.
Walter went homeless for a story, and it's a story that will live in infamy. We'll be right back.
This is Roe and Roeper, Chicago's talk leader, 89 WLS.
We're remembering Jake Hartford, who was born Jim Edwards, who was before he was a weekend radio legend here on WLS. He was a legendary, and I mean that in a very serious way, legendary television producer in Chicago. Many, many years with Walter Jacobson, who's joining us now. And I just want to tell a little story, and I'm going to have Walter just remember, Walter, you're under oath. You've been down this road before. The first time you went homeless for CBS,
right?
It was a sweeps piece that they had tried in Miami with, of all people, Giselle Fernandez.
Right.
And they said, they worked really well in the November sweeps, so the following February sweeps of like 1989, 90, whatever year that was, they decided they're going to take Walter and put him out on the streets as a homeless guy. And they got a Hollywood makeup artist, right?
Right.
Come sit down with you, make you into this guy. Looks a little Clouseau-esque, but it worked.
Right. And
you went out on the street. And I had gone back I was working here already at the time, but I'd come back and taken a part-time. I was helping with that story because it was pretty labor intensive, and there was a chase van, and Jake was driving the chase van, and we could hear Walter because he was wearing a mic. He was mic'd, and there was a radio frequency mic that we could, if we were close enough to you within a block or so, we could hear what you were saying, and we had a camera guy in our van, and then there was another camera guy dressed as a homeless guy who was with you, right?
Right.
Well, at one point, maybe you'd been on the street 12 hours, you got really cold.
It was cold. It was February, 12 degrees below, really cold.
Yes, really, really cold. And it was the corner of Clark and Fullerton. He'd actually gone to Bill Curtis's house, it was not too far from there, and knocked on the door and scared Bill's friends. And you were trying to get something to eat. You were panhandling for something to eat, and you said, I got to get in the van, I got to get in the van, I got to get in the van. And so we put you in the van for about, 5 or 6 minutes while we're kind of talking about the next thing that we were going to do. And Jim, at some point, turned to Walter and goes, just get the hell out of the van, would you? Just get out! Just get out!
He did.
And you did. And you went into a homeless shelter, and one of the people at the homeless shelter put his hand on your back, and it was warm. And he turns to Walter and goes, get out of here, cop.
Wow. That's right. You're right. And you remember that from
I heard it. We were in the van. We heard it. And then Walter had to walk from Fullerton up to Wilson, which is where that very famous moment where he didn't sleep, and he walked that entire time in the 12 degrees, and I'm really, really miserable moment, which will live on in infamy, came from.
And the only problem with the whole thing is that I got a lot of criticism for it, for being who I was not, and for being only a couple of days on the street to try to tell a story about the homeless. And my response to that has always been, I still believe it, that even if it's for 24 hours, even if it's for 15 hours, to experience what those people are experiencing is something that the average viewer in Chicago television has a duty to really see and understand.
Yeah, it was.
You literally walked a mile in someone else's shoes. Absolutely.
That's right. You don't know.
Walter, thank you.
Thanks
for
Walter.
being here. Appreciate it.
Really
and I know you have a lot of emotion, as we all do today, about this. So I appreciate you being here.
Well, thanks for having me come in, and for the memories, because we did it all together.
Yeah.
Thanks, Walter.
Richard, great seeing you.
Good seeing you as well.
Back right after this.